Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell for new stories. The galaxy was a vast, indifferent place, filled with advanced civilizations and a multitude of species. The Galactic Council, a collection of the universe's most intelligent and powerful beings, had long prided itself on its ability to predict the behaviors of various species. Whether it was the wrath of the K'rai, the cunning of the Zariq, or the stoicism of the Eryxians, they had seen it all. But one thing had always eluded them: the human reaction to injustice. Humans were an oddity. Their history was full of conflict, but they were also known for their ability to forgive, to find peace after wars, and to rebuild after destruction. The Council had often considered their capacity for rage to be mild compared to other species. They were prone to overexpressions of emotion, true, but it was thought that they never truly tapped into the depth of their fury. That is, until they encountered a human mother whose rage could no longer be contained. It began on a small, unassuming planet on the fringe of Council space. The human species had long settled in the region, finding a comfortable home amidst the more neutral races. In a quiet farming colony, a woman named Elena Turner raised her 2 young children, keeping to a peaceful life far from the political turmoil of the galaxy. The planet, called Rona 2, was a place where humans and several other species coexisted, trading goods and sharing resources. However, one fateful day everything changed. The Drakari, a brutal and warlike race known for their merciless conquests, arrived without warning. Their ships descended on Rona 2, their blackened hulls casting shadows over the planet's tranquil landscape. The Drakari had a reputation for pillaging and enslaving weaker species, and the humans on Rona 2 were not prepared for the onslaught. The Drakari had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit, a mistake that would soon become their undoing. Elena's husband, Michael, was among the first to resist. A former soldier, he fought bravely to protect their home, but the odds were stacked against him. The Drakari overwhelmed the human forces, and in the chaos, Michael was captured. Elena, too, was taken, along with her children. The Drakari had no interest in killing them. Instead, they saw the humans as valuable commodities for trade. Elena's heart shattered as she watched her children, frightened and confused, being carted away like livestock. In the underground holding cells, Elena's mind raced. She could hear the calls of her children from nearby, their voices tinged with fear. But there was something in her heart, something primal that stirred deep within her. Her rage was a slow burn, smoldering at first, and then it exploded like a supernova. The Galactic Council, sitting in their ivory tower on the Council world, had not yet noticed the growing storm on Rona 2. They were distracted by the usual politics of the galaxy: trade agreements, disputes over territory, and diplomatic gatherings. They had no idea that one human woman, shackled and imprisoned, was about to unleash a force they could not comprehend. Elena's anger was not just for her family, but for the hundreds of others the Drakari had taken. The injustice of it was unbearable, and for the first time she felt something far darker than anything she had ever known. A quiet voice in her head whispered that she was not powerless, that she was more than just a mother. She was the embodiment of every human who had ever fought against tyranny, against oppression. Her captors underestimated her, thinking her merely a grief-stricken woman. They mocked her, treating her as nothing more than a prisoner. But Elena's mind was already working, calculating, planning. In the dead of night, when the Drakari soldiers relaxed their vigilance, Elena made her move. She slipped from her restraints, the rage within her fueling every step. Her mind was no longer clouded by fear, it was razor-sharp, guided by a singular purpose: to free her children and exact vengeance upon those who had dared to harm her family. With her mind sharp as a blade, Elena used every skill she had learned over the years: her husband's training in combat, her own instincts, and her ability to adapt to any situation. It was not long before she had freed herself from her cell, and soon after, she was moving through the dark corridors of the Drakari ship with a silent, deadly grace. Her fury had transformed her into something else entirely, a force of nature, unstoppable and fierce. She found her children first, locked in a small cell, terrified but alive. Without hesitation, she freed them, her embrace the only comfort they needed. But there was no time for sentiment. Elena knew the Drakari would soon realize their mistake and come for them. She needed to strike fast. The sound of Drakari boots echoed down the hall, and Elena's plan was set into motion. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for every human who had ever suffered at the hands of those who sought to dominate. She was fighting for something greater than revenge. It was a fight for survival. As the first wave of Drakari soldiers appeared at the end of the hall, Elena stepped forward, her eyes blazing with the fire of a mother's wrath. The council would soon learn just how wrong they were about human rage. And they would learn it at the hands of a mother who had lost everything. The galaxy was about to change forever. The Drakari soldiers were a formidable force, their immense, armored bodies towering over most species they encountered. They were known for their ruthlessness, their strength in numbers and their savage fighting techniques. But in that moment, as they clattered through the hallways of their warship, a sense of arrogance radiated from them. They had captured the humans, had reduced them to mere slaves. What could one mother possibly do? Elena Turner was not just one mother. She was the mother of every human who had ever fought against the odds. And she was driven by a vengeance so pure and focused, it could not be measured by the standards of any species the Drakari had ever encountered. The first wave of Drakari soldiers rounded the corner, their weapons raised, ready to neutralize any threat. Elena, with her children close behind, crouched in the shadows. Her heart pounded, not with fear but with a quiet, dangerous certainty. She had seen combat before, learned enough about the ways of war from her late husband, Michael, who had been a soldier. But it was not his training that guided her now, it was the rage burning in her veins, the primal instinct to protect what was hers. In the blink of an eye, Elena was on them. The first soldier fell before he even knew she was there. Elena moved like lightning, using the Drakari's own arrogance against them. She grabbed one of their bladed weapons from a nearby rack, the weapon's weight surprisingly light in her hands. With a swift motion, she slit the throat of the first Drakari, and his body crumpled to the floor with a soft thud. The other soldiers hesitated for a moment, too stunned by the sudden attack to react. That hesitation was enough. Elena was already on the next soldier, using her momentum to disarm him and incapacitate him with a brutal twist of his arm. The Drakari howled in pain, but Elena's grip was unyielding. His weapon clattered to the floor, and before he could cry for help, she silenced him with a swift strike to his chest. 2 down. The remaining soldiers finally realized they were under attack. A third soldier, larger than the others, roared in fury and charged at Elena, swinging a massive axe with terrifying force. Elena's eyes locked onto him, and in that moment, time seemed to slow. She dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the axe as it cleaved through the air where her head had been moments before. She rolled on the ground, coming to her feet with a fluid grace. The Drakari soldier was quick to recover, but Elena was faster. She darted to his blind side, using her superior agility to strike at his unprotected flank. The soldier staggered, a grunt of pain escaping his throat as Elena buried the blade into his side. His massive body fell to the floor, but before it hit the ground, Elena was already moving, her eyes scanning for the next target. She wasn't just reacting anymore, she was anticipating, seeing the movements of her enemies before they made them. Her children, wide-eyed but silent, watched her every move. Elena had told them to stay back, to remain hidden until it was safe, and they obeyed. But Elena's heart swelled with pride even as her fury surged. She could see the small flicker of understanding in their eyes. They were not afraid of her. No, they were afraid for her, for what she was becoming. The transformation that had begun with their capture was now complete. Elena was not just their protector anymore. She had become something else entirely. More soldiers arrived, but this time Elena was prepared. Her mind raced as she set her traps, using the environment to her advantage. The narrow hallways, the ventilation shafts, the various alcoves and hidden nooks, all became part of her strategy. She lured the Drakari in, letting them think they had the upper hand, and then struck without mercy. One by one the Drakari fell. Their towering forms crumpled under the weight of Elena's fury. She had no hesitation, no doubts. The weapons she used were not just tools of destruction, they were symbols of her purpose. Each kill was not a loss of life but a step toward reclaiming her own, a way of taking back control from those who thought they could dominate her. But it wasn't just about revenge. As Elena moved through the ship, dismantling the Drakari presence one piece at a time, her thoughts began to drift. The Galactic Council, those distant, self-important beings who had underestimated her species, how would they react when they saw this? The counselors who had so long dismissed humans as emotional and weak, would now have to confront the reality of what a human could do when pushed too far. Elena had no doubt that the Drakari were part of a larger scheme, a plan involving the trade of slaves and resources that spanned across the galaxy. But to her, that was secondary to the immediate task at hand. She was fighting for her children, for her home, and for every other human who had ever suffered under the heel of tyranny. As the blood of the Drakari stained the floors of their own ship, Elena's resolve hardened. And then she heard it, the sound of more footsteps, this time echoing from a much larger corridor. The Drakari had called for reinforcements. Elena's grip tightened on her weapon and her mind focused. She wasn't done yet. She had come this far. She would not stop until every last one of her captors had paid for what they had done. The battle was far from over. But Elena knew that her rage had become something unstoppable, something the galaxy would never forget. And in the depths of her fury she found something else, a calm, unshakable certainty. Her children would be safe. And the Drakari would learn, in no uncertain terms, just how wrong they had been about humans. As the reinforcements closed in, Elena raised her weapon, a fierce grin spreading across her face. The real fight had only just begun. The heavy thud of boots reverberated through the metallic corridors, signaling the arrival of the Drakari reinforcements. Elena knew that if she was to save her children and escape the Drakari ship, she would need to act fast. There was no time for hesitation. The Drakari were notorious for their overwhelming numbers, and now they had the advantage of surprise on their side. Yet the thought of retreat was foreign to her mind. She had already come too far, bled too much, and killed too many of them to turn back now. The Drakari soldiers who had fallen before her were numerous, but they were far from the last. Elena could hear their war cries echoing down the hallways, a reminder that she was not alone. Their voices were like a challenge to her, a call for her to prove herself once more. But Elena was no longer the woman who had entered that ship out of fear for her children's lives. She had evolved into something darker, something more lethal. And with each passing moment, that transformation became more apparent. She moved swiftly through the ship, pausing only long enough to check on her children, who were following behind her like shadows. Their small hands grasped at her cloak, their faces filled with a mix of awe and fear. Elena didn't want to show her children the full extent of what she had become, but there was no denying the ferocity in her eyes. It was the same ferocity that burned in every mother who had ever fought to protect her own. As Elena navigated the corridors, she took note of the ship's layout. She had seen enough of it by now to recognize the key points, the weapons rooms, the auxiliary power systems, and the control hubs where the Drakari operated their most advanced technologies. If she could access the control room, she could shut down their ship systems, cripple their ability to track her, and give herself and her children the edge they needed. The next wave of Drakari soldiers came around the corner, but this time Elena was ready. With a speed that shocked even her, she dashed forward, slicing through the air with her weapon, disarming one soldier with a well-placed strike. Before he could react, she incapacitated him with a crushing blow to the chest. Her children, despite the chaos unfolding around them, remained silent. Elena had taught them the importance of staying hidden when danger was near, and they obeyed without question. She was grateful for their obedience. They understood the stakes of the situation. Another soldier, this one far more experienced than the previous ones, rushed toward her, his combat suit gleaming in the dim light. His weapon, a plasma rifle, buzzed to life as he aimed at her. Elena didn't hesitate. She threw herself to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast that scorched the floor where she had been standing. She rolled into the nearest alcove, her mind calculating the next move. The Drakari soldier followed, confident in his ability to take her down. But Elena was already on her feet, her movements as fluid and precise as a dancer's. She twisted his arm, using his own momentum against him, and with a quick snap she sent him crashing to the ground unconscious. Her breathing was steady but her pulse raced. Each kill brought her closer to the heart of the ship. And each moment fueled the growing fire inside her, a fire that burned hotter and brighter with every passing second. With the hallways momentarily cleared, Elena led her children to a small maintenance access hatch she had noticed earlier. It was hidden in plain sight, a simple door that looked like any other. But Elena knew it would lead her to the heart of the ship's systems. She had no time to waste. They moved quickly, entering the dark, narrow passage that twisted through the innards of the warship. The air inside was thick with the scent of oil and machinery, and the walls seemed to pulse with the ship's power. Elena led the way, her senses alert for any signs of danger. Her children were close behind, their faces pale but resolute. As they navigated the maze-like corridors, Elena's mind raced. She had to reach the control room before the Drakari realized what she was doing. Once they figured out that their ship was under attack, they would stop at nothing to prevent her from succeeding. Minutes passed, and Elena could feel the tension in the air growing thicker with every step. She was getting closer. The hum of the ship's engines was louder now, the low-frequency vibrations echoing through the passageways. And then, just as they reached the final junction, Elena paused. She heard voices, Drakari voices, coming from the other side of a nearby door. "Elena," whispered her daughter, Sophie, clutching her mother's sleeve. Elena turned to her children, her expression fierce but filled with determination. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say and don't make a sound." Her voice was low, steady, and commanding, but there was no mistaking the urgency in her words. Her son Adam nodded silently, his hand squeezing his mother's. The trust in their eyes was unwavering. Elena took a deep breath and signaled for them to follow as she slipped into a nearby alcove. The Drakari soldiers were too close now. There was no room for error. She peered around the corner and saw a small group of Drakari soldiers gathered around a console, engaged in conversation. They hadn't noticed her yet, but their attention was about to change. Elena had no intention of letting them alert the rest of the ship. Without making a sound, she reached into her belt and pulled out a small but deadly explosive device. It was a simple thing, nothing like the advanced technology the Drakari wielded, but it would do the job. She had learned how to make these from the best, the soldiers who had trained her husband, the same soldiers who had fought in the human wars back home. With the device in hand, Elena crept forward, her movements calculated, her mind focused. She had one chance. One opportunity to knock out the Drakari control systems and turn the tide in her favor. She knew that if she succeeded, the ship would be in chaos. The Drakari would lose their ability to track her, and she would have the upper hand. As the seconds stretched on, Elena held her breath. The time for action had arrived. With a single, swift motion, she activated the explosive device and tossed it into the center of the room. The explosion was deafening. In the aftermath, as the smoke and debris settled, Elena stood tall, her children safely behind her. She could hear the alarms blaring throughout the ship. The Drakari were no longer in control. Now it was her turn. The galaxy would know the power of human rage, and they would never forget the price of underestimating it. The blast sent a shockwave through the Drakari ship, shaking the very foundations of the warship. Elena stood at the threshold of the wreckage, her pulse quickening as the echoes of the explosion reverberated through the steel walls. The force of the blast had sent several of the Drakari soldiers flying, their heavy bodies crumpling against the walls, their weapons scattering to the floor. The once calm and orderly atmosphere of the ship had now devolved into chaos. Alarms blared, and the red emergency lights bathed the corridors in a sinister hue. The Drakari were disoriented, stumbling through the smoke and debris, scrambling to regain control of their ship. But Elena knew there was no turning back now. She had shattered their command center and with it their ability to track her movements. The ship's systems were in disarray and they were vulnerable. She wasted no time. "Stay close," Elena murmured to her children as she led them through the wreckage. Her eyes never stopped scanning the surroundings, her senses sharp as a blade. She could hear the shouts of Drakari soldiers in the distance, their guttural voices echoing through the smoke-filled hallways. They were already regrouping, attempting to organize themselves despite the damage. But Elena had the upper hand now. She had crippled their control systems and their ship was in turmoil. The Drakari were no longer the predators, they were the prey. As she moved deeper into the ship's interior, Elena's mind raced. The control room had been a success, but there were still more obstacles to overcome. She had to keep her children safe, and there was still one final objective to complete: the Drakari leader. Elena had learned from one of the soldiers she'd interrogated that the commanding officer of this ship, a Drakari general named Vargoth, was on board. It was Vargoth who had given the orders to invade Rona II and enslave its people. He was the architect of her family's suffering, the one who had allowed her husband to be captured, her children to be taken. And Elena knew deep in her bones that she could not let him live. Not after everything they had done. She moved swiftly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the metal floors as they traversed the darkened ship. The Drakari, now frantic, had started to mount a defense, but Elena had already accounted for their movements. With every step, she placed herself further ahead, guiding her children through the labyrinth of corridors with uncanny precision. The ship's central hall was a vast, open expanse, and Elena knew that if she was going to confront Vargoth, she would have to go through it. It was the heart of the warship, where the most elite Drakari warriors patrolled, where the ship's final defenses were stationed. The sound of heavy footsteps reached her ears. Several Drakari soldiers were making their way toward the central hall, no doubt alerted to the explosion and the chaos spreading through the ship. Elena's heart raced as she crouched behind a series of crates, her breath steady, her mind laser-focused. Her children crouched silently beside her, their eyes wide with fear but trusting their mother implicitly. Elena had trained them for moments like this: how to remain silent, how to stay out of sight, how to survive. The soldiers passed without noticing them, their heavy armor clanging with each step. Once they were out of earshot, Elena led her children out from behind the crates and continued her journey toward the command center. Minutes later, they arrived at a reinforced door, the entrance to the heart of the Drakari warship. The door was locked, and Elena could hear the low murmur of voices behind it. Vargoth and his inner circle. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. Elena signaled for her children to stay back and pressed herself against the cold metal door. Her pulse surged with anticipation. She could feel the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her. This was the moment when everything she had fought for would either come to fruition or fall apart. But there was no turning back now. She reached into her utility belt and pulled out a small explosive charge. It wasn't as powerful as the device she had used earlier, but it would be enough to breach the door and give her the element of surprise. With a quick, precise motion, Elena attached the charge to the door's lock mechanism and stepped back. Her heart beat louder. Then the countdown in her mind. The device was small but deadly, and it wouldn't take long for it to do its job. The explosion was quieter this time, more contained, but the force was still enough to send the door flying open with a metallic screech. Elena wasted no time. She stormed into the room, her weapon raised, her eyes scanning for her target. Vargotha's guards reacted with alarming speed, but Elena was faster. She ducked behind a column as plasma shots flew past her, narrowly missing her. She returned fire, taking down 2 of the guards in a matter of seconds. The Drakari were brutal fighters, but Elena was fueled by something they could never understand. She wasn't fighting for glory or for power. She was fighting for justice, for revenge, for her family. The Drakari general himself, Vargoth, stood in the center of the room, towering over his subordinates. His dark, reptilian eyes locked onto Elena, a sinister smile crossing his scarred face. He knew who she was. He knew why she had come. "You should have stayed in your cage, human," Vargotha's voice was low, dripping with contempt. "But you will die like the others." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her grip on her weapon tightened as she raised it, aiming directly at Vargotha's chest. "You made one fatal mistake," Elena said, her voice icy with fury. "You underestimated me." Without another word, she pulled the trigger. The shot hit Vargoth square in the chest, sending him reeling back with a guttural roar. He fell to the ground, his massive form crashing into the metal floor, his once proud armor crumpling beneath him. The room fell silent. Elena stood over him, breathing heavily, her eyes cold with the fire of vengeance. The Drakari general was finished. But the fight wasn't over. Elena's heart still beat with purpose. The warship was in disarray, but there was still work to do. The galaxy needed to know that humans were not to be trifled with, not anymore. Her children approached cautiously, their small hands clasped together. Elena looked down at them, her eyes softening for just a moment. They had been through so much, and yet they had remained by her side, unwavering. "We're not done yet," Elena said, her voice steady and filled with resolve. "But we're one step closer." And with that, she turned toward the ship's control systems, ready to finish what she had started. The galaxy would remember the wrath of a mother, and it would never forget. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she looked down at the fallen form of General Vargoth. His massive body lay in a heap on the cold, metallic floor, and for a moment, it seemed as if the entire ship was holding its breath. Her weapon was still raised, but her mind was already 2 steps ahead, calculating the next move. The Drakari had lost their leader and their defenses were in disarray, but the warship still thrummed with power, still a threat. Her children, wide-eyed but now filled with a quiet sense of awe, watched from the doorway. Their hands were clasped tightly together, and though they were scared, there was also a spark of something else in their eyes, understanding. They had seen what their mother was capable of now. She wasn't just their protector, she was their savior. "We need to move," Elena said, her voice steady, almost cold as she snapped back into her role as leader. "The Drakari will regroup and they'll send everything they have to stop us. We need to get to the ship's core and disable the engines. If we can shut down their power, we can prevent them from pursuing us." Adam, her son, nodded. His expression was serious, his small hand gripping his sister's. Elena had no doubt that both of her children had been forever changed by the events of the past hours. They had witnessed the raw power of her determination, and now they were growing into warriors in their own right. She could see it in the way they moved, the way they followed her lead without hesitation. She turned her attention to the room around her, quickly assessing the situation. The Drakari soldiers were still alive, though severely injured, scattered throughout the command center. They were weak, disoriented, and unable to mount any meaningful defense. The ship's control panel flickered, evidence of the explosion and the chaos that had followed. Come on, Elena urged, pulling her children back toward the hallway. We can't waste time. With Vargoth dead and the ship's command center disabled, the Drakari would be scrambling to regain control. It was only a matter of time before reinforcements arrived, and Elena knew the ship's core was their only chance. She led her children through the maze of corridors, moving quickly but cautiously. Every turn was an opportunity for ambush, every corner a potential threat. Yet, with every step, Elena's resolve grew firmer. She had come too far to stop now. As they moved deeper into the bowels of the warship, Elena could feel the tension building. The alarms had intensified, and the ship's emergency lights blinked in an erratic, chaotic pattern. The Drakari would be able to hear the explosions, see the destruction she had wrought. But that was the beauty of it. Their arrogance had blinded them to the tenacity of a single human mother. Elena had taken everything they had thrown at her, and she had given them something back they would never forget. A reckoning. They passed several other maintenance rooms and storage spaces, each one empty but eerily silent. The Drakari were trying to regroup, but their disorganization was evident. Their soldiers were being picked off by survivors from earlier battles, their communication systems crippled. Elena had thrown the entire ship into chaos, and now she would make sure it stayed that way. Mom, where are we going? Sophie asked, her voice small but steady as she clutched her mother's side. The innocence in her eyes contrasted sharply with the violence they had just experienced, but Elena knew that her daughter was beginning to understand the world in a different light. She had seen the strength of her mother, had witnessed what was possible when a person was pushed too far. We're heading to the engines, Elena replied, her voice low but filled with purpose. Once we disable their power, we can escape. They won't be able to follow us. As they neared the core section of the ship, the sound of distant footsteps caught Elena's attention. The Drakari had arrived, reinforcing the area and preparing for a final stand. They were coming in numbers now, desperate to stop the human woman who had wreaked so much havoc in such a short time. Elena knew that time was running out. The Drakari soldiers were closing in on their location, and their firepower would be overwhelming. She had no doubt that the warship had been designed to withstand external threats, but humans were not something the Drakari had accounted for. They had miscalculated one crucial thing: the depths of human rage. She grabbed her children's hands, pulling them into a narrow side corridor as the sounds of the approaching soldiers grew louder. The walls vibrated with the heavy boots of the Drakari, the urgency in their steps unmistakable. Elena didn't have time to stop them all. She needed a distraction. A flash of inspiration hit her. The ship's core was located just past the central control room, which led to a series of conduits that powered the entire vessel. If she could disable the main access points to the core, she could trigger a cascading failure that would shut down the entire system. But that meant she had to face the Drakari soldiers head-on. She turned to her children, her eyes softening for just a moment. You two stay here. Don't move no matter what. Sophie and Adam nodded, their expressions serious. They trusted her completely. With one final glance at them, Elena steeled herself. She would need every ounce of her strength to make it through this final push. Her mind raced through her options, calculating, planning. The Drakari soldiers would be looking for her in the control room, expecting her to come from that direction. That gave her an advantage. She sprinted toward the control room's entrance, pausing just beyond the threshold to get a look at the soldiers inside. They were gathered around a console, shouting orders to one another. They hadn't noticed her yet. Elena's fingers tightened around the small explosive charge in her pocket. It wasn't the largest device she had, but it would be enough to breach the control room and disable their systems long enough to reach the core. With a swift motion, she pulled the pin and tossed the charge into the center of the room. The explosion was timed perfectly, and the shockwave rattled the ship once again, sending the Drakari soldiers into a panic. Their weapons fired blindly, but Elena was already on the move, darting past the wreckage and into the narrow access tunnel that led to the heart of the ship. Adrenaline coursed through her veins as she pushed forward, determined. The ship groaned under the weight of the damage, but Elena was unwavering. She could hear the sounds of the Drakari pursuing her, but they were no longer her concern. The power core was within reach. As she neared the core room, her thoughts shifted to her children. They were safe for now. She just needed to finish this. Once the power was gone, they could escape. And the galaxy would know that humans, even in the face of overwhelming odds, would never back down. With one final push, Elena entered the power room, ready to make the final strike. The power core room hummed with the sound of raw energy coursing through the ship's systems. Elena could feel the vibrations beneath her feet as she stood at the threshold of the room, surveying the vast, intricate structure of cables and conduits that powered the entire Drakari warship. This was the heart of the beast, and with it, the very soul of the Drakari's invasion force. But for Elena, it was the final step. The last stage of her mission. And there was no room for failure. The room was massive, the central power core glowing in ominous blue as it pulsed with energy. Surrounding it were massive conduits and power grids that seemed to stretch endlessly, each connected to vital systems throughout the ship. From here, Elena could shut down the engines, cripple the Drakari's ability to pursue her, and ensure that this ship would never threaten another human colony again. Her fingers trembled as she pulled a data pad from her belt, quickly accessing the systems. The ship's power grid was a labyrinth of protocols, but Elena had studied enough to know where the shutdown sequence was buried. She had learned from her encounters with Drakari technology. Sometimes brute force was the only solution. "Mom, be careful," Sophie whispered, her voice filled with concern as she watched her mother prepare to make the final move. Adam, beside her, was silent but resolute. Elena had taught them how to survive this world and they had learned well. But even with all of her preparations, Elena couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. She turned to them with a small, reassuring smile. "Stay hidden and don't make a sound. If anything goes wrong, you know what to do." They nodded in unison, their faces filled with the maturity of children who had seen too much, but also the strength of those who understood what needed to be done. Elena couldn't afford to waste another second. Her fingers flew across the screen of the data pad as she navigated the Drakari's intricate security protocols. She had to get the sequence just right. If she triggered it too early, the core would remain active, and if she made a mistake, the whole ship could self-destruct. There was no room for error. The moment the countdown began, Elena felt an immense weight lift from her shoulders. The core's power was beginning to shut down. The room's hum shifted, a deep groan emanating from the core as it began to lose its energy. But before she could fully exhale, a loud, shrill alarm blared through the room. She spun toward the door. The Drakari had found her. A group of soldiers, fully armored and armed, stormed into the room, their plasma rifles aimed directly at her. The leader, a hulking Drakari warrior with jet-black scales, locked eyes with Elena, a malicious grin spreading across his reptilian face. "You think you can destroy us, human?" he snarled, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. "You are nothing. Just a fleeting speck in the universe. And now you will die." Elena's heart pounded, but she didn't hesitate. With a single, swift motion, she dropped the data pad and pulled her sidearm from its holster. The first soldier fell before he could even raise his rifle, a clean shot through the heart. The others didn't hesitate either, firing in her direction with ruthless precision. But Elena was faster. She dove behind a large conduit, using it as cover as plasma shots sizzled past her. She peeked out, taking down another Drakari before ducking back into safety. Her children were still behind her, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Every moment counted. The Drakari leader bellowed a command, and the remaining soldiers moved to surround her. She could hear their boots pounding on the metal floor as they closed in on her position, but Elena had already anticipated this. She quickly reached into her bag and tossed a small flash grenade into the center of the room. The explosion of light blinded the Drakari soldiers, allowing Elena to move with brutal efficiency. In the blink of an eye, she took down two more, her weapon flashing with deadly accuracy. But the leader, his scales gleaming and eyes burning with fury, charged toward her, undeterred by the chaos around him. He swung his massive sword, a weapon designed for one purpose, to cleave through armor and bone with a single strike. Elena didn't have time to think. She ducked, rolling to the side, and barely avoided the deadly arc of the blade. The force of the swing created a gust of wind that knocked her off balance, but she recovered in an instant. Her hand shot out, grabbing a small explosive charge from her belt. She had one last option. The Drakari leader advanced, his rage evident in every step. Elena hurled the charge at him, knowing it was her last shot. The explosion was enough to knock him back, sending him crashing into one of the ship's power conduits, the blast causing sparks to fly in every direction. For a moment, the room fell silent. Elena held her breath, watching the leader struggle to rise. His armor was cracked, his body battered by the explosion. His eyes met hers one last time, a look of disbelief and fury in his reptilian gaze. Then with a final roar he collapsed. The room was still. But Elena knew there was no time to waste. The countdown was almost complete. She rushed back to the console and quickly finished entering the final shutdown commands. The ship's engines would be completely disabled in mere moments. The room's hum slowed, and the bright blue glow of the core dimmed, signaling the near-complete shutdown of the warship's power systems. Elena took a deep breath, her heart racing as the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hallways. She turned back to her children, who had been waiting in the corner, their faces etched with concern. They had witnessed everything, the chaos, the death, and the destruction. But they were still there, still alive. "It's done," Elena said, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "The ship's power is disabled. We can leave." Sophie and Adam ran to her, and Elena pulled them into a tight embrace, the weight of everything finally beginning to settle on her shoulders. She had done it. The Drakari warship was crippled, its engines gone, its soldiers scattered and broken. And they would not be able to pursue her. But even in this moment of victory, Elena knew that their journey wasn't over. There were still more battles to fight. The Drakari might have lost one warship, but there were many more out there. For now, though, Elena had one. And the galaxy would remember that when humanity fought for survival, there was no force more deadly than the love of a mother. Elena stood at the threshold of the disabled power core room, her body still buzzing with adrenaline from the intense battle. Her weapon hung loosely at her side, now merely a tool, a lifeline to the past that was quickly fading. As she glanced back at the flickering blue glow of the core, now dimmed to a dull, harmless pulse, she could feel a sense of finality settling in. The warship was crippled, its engines silent, its soldiers scattered and leaderless. For the first time in hours, the chaos had died down, replaced by a heavy silence that filled the hollow corridors. Her children clung to her, each one gripping her hand as if they feared she might slip away into the abyss of the warship's wreckage. They had seen so much, too much. Yet, their eyes were full of determination, their spirits unbroken. They had weathered the storm together, and now they were on the cusp of freedom. But Elena knew their work wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "We need to move now," she urged, her voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing on her. They had no more time to linger in the heart of the Drakari ship. The longer they stayed, the greater the chance that reinforcements would arrive, or worse, that the warship's automated systems might reactivate. The ship was already starting to groan and shake beneath them. Its systems were shutting down, but the aftershocks of their battle could still trigger catastrophic failures. Sophie and Adam nodded without a word, their eyes locking on their mother with quiet trust. They were fighters now, each in their own way. Elena had raised them to survive, to adapt, and it had paid off. But the journey they had been on had changed them. It had changed everything. The trio quickly made their way through the darkened halls, moving past the wreckage of the Drakari soldiers, who were now nothing more than lifeless bodies scattered like broken dolls. The smell of burning metal and scorched flesh hung thick in the air, but Elena pressed on, her senses sharp, scanning every corner for threats. It wasn't just the soldiers she was worried about. The Drakari were unpredictable, and their vengeance could strike from anywhere. As they neared the docking bay, Elena's heart skipped a beat. There it was. The escape shuttle, still intact despite the destruction that had spread throughout the warship. It had been left behind when the Drakari had initially boarded, their arrogance blinding them to the possibility that they might need an escape route. It was their mistake, their hubris, and Elena had made them pay for it. The shuttle's sleek, dark form gleamed in the dim emergency lighting, its system still active enough to allow them to escape. Elena's hand tightened on her children's as she approached, but her instincts told her they weren't alone. "Wait," she whispered, pausing just before they stepped into the shuttle's docking bay. Her sharp eyes scanned the shadows ahead. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps, too quiet, too deliberate to be a Drakari soldier's clumsy stomp. Someone was out there, someone who had been following them. A figure stepped into view. At first, Elena thought it might be a Drakari soldier, a last-ditch effort to finish the job. But as the figure emerged from the shadows, her breath caught in her throat. A human. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a grim expression etched into his face. He was wearing the uniform of a Galactic Council officer, though it was tattered and dirted from the conflict. His eyes narrowed as he sized up Elena and her children, the recognition dawning slowly on his face. "Elena," the man said softly, his voice full of both surprise and relief. "I didn't think I'd find you here. I thought you were dead?" Elena finished the sentence for him, her voice cold. She didn't lower her weapon, but there was something in her eyes that softened as she took in the stranger's face. The man was familiar, a flash of a memory in her mind. One of the Council's operatives who had helped in the initial response to the Drakari attacks on Rona II. They had crossed paths once, a long time ago during the early days of the invasion. She hadn't expected to see him again, especially not here on a ship that had once been the enemy's. "I'm not dead," Elena said with a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And you're in the wrong place. You need to leave." The man's eyes flicked to the two children standing beside her, and then back to Elena. "I see," he said quietly. "I should have known better than to underestimate you." He straightened, his voice hardening. "But you're not the only one who's had enough of the Drakari. I'm with a special task force sent to take them down. We've been tracking this ship for days, waiting for the right moment to strike." Elena's gaze narrowed, her suspicions rising. "A task force," she repeated. "And you were just waiting?" The officer's jaw clenched, but his gaze softened as he looked at the children. "We weren't sure what we'd find. You don't always know what you're walking into with the Drakari. They're unpredictable." "I'm walking into a mess," Elena said, lowering her weapon slightly but not letting her guard down. "And I don't have time for anyone who isn't here to help." The officer hesitated for a long moment before nodding. "I understand. But I can help you get out of here. The shuttle's ready for launch and we've secured the docking bay. You won't be followed?" Elena didn't take her eyes off him. She knew that trust in situations like these was a luxury she couldn't afford. The officer's words sounded good, but there were too many unknowns. Too many variables she couldn't account for. Still, she was running out of options. The warship systems were deteriorating fast, and if they didn't leave now, they would be trapped. She looked down at her children, who were still standing silently behind her, their faces a mix of fear and quiet hope. She could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They had come so far, fought so hard, and now the possibility of safety was within reach. But it wouldn't be safe until they were off the warship, until they were free. "Get in," Elena finally said, her voice steady. "We'll talk later." The officer didn't argue. He led the way, opening the shuttle's hatch and gesturing for Elena and her children to follow. The door hissed as it closed behind them, sealing them inside the ship's sleek interior. It was a quiet, smooth ride, a far cry from the chaos they'd just left behind. As the shuttle's engines hummed to life, Elena sat in the pilot's seat, her fingers gripping the controls with practiced ease. The officer remained silent behind her, a quiet observer to the journey ahead. The children, meanwhile, settled into the seats beside her, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the shuttle's control panel. Elena's heart still raced as the shuttle began to pull away from the warship, slowly at first, then picking up speed. They broke through the atmosphere and into the vastness of space, the Drakari warship now a distant memory. But as the stars stretched out before them, Elena knew this wasn't the end. The battle was far from over. The Drakari had felt the sting of human resistance, but there were still more battles to fight. The galaxy wasn't safe yet. She glanced at her children, their faces filled with a mix of exhaustion and hope. And for the first time in a long while, Elena allowed herself to hope too. The shuttle soared through the vast expanse of space, leaving the shattered remains of the Drakari warship behind. The stars seemed to stretch endlessly before them, a canvas of infinite possibility. Elena sat at the controls, her fingers still firm on the wheel, guiding them away from the wreckage of the enemy vessel. Her body was weary, every muscle aching, but there was a strange sense of relief that filled her chest. She had made it. They had made it. But the journey was far from over. Behind her, Sophie and Adam sat quietly, their faces illuminated by the soft light of the shuttle's interior. They were no longer children caught in a nightmare. They were survivors, seasoned by the battles they had faced. Elena had seen them change, seen them grow in ways that no mother could have imagined. But she was proud of them. She always would be. The officer remained at the back of the shuttle, his presence a silent but constant reminder of the uncertain future that lay ahead. Elena had let him on board without much trust, but now that they were in the safety of the shuttle, she had time to assess the situation more clearly. Who was he? What was his agenda? The Drakari warship had been crippled, but the invasion was far from over. There were more warships, more soldiers, more battles to fight. The officer cleared his throat, his voice breaking the silence. "We're heading for a rendezvous point," he said, sounding as though he had been planning it for a long time. "There's a safe zone in the outer rim, a human enclave. It's small but it's secure. We've been gathering survivors and intelligence from the Drakari's fleets. We've learned more than we've let on." Elena didn't turn to face him, but her mind raced. The thought of a safe zone was a small comfort, but she knew better than to believe in the concept of true safety in a galaxy at war. "How secure can it be if we're talking about a human enclave?" she asked, her voice guarded. "The Drakari will hunt us down if we don't strike back. We can't hide forever." The officer's voice was quiet, filled with an odd kind of resolve. It's not about hiding. It's about regrouping. We've been tracking Drakari movements for months. They're fractured. Their leadership is disintegrating. We've had success in hitting their supply lines, their communications, their infrastructure. They're not as unified as they want us to believe. Elena turned her head, looking over her shoulder at the officer. His expression was hard to read, but there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of determination, of a shared understanding. You think you can take them on with a handful of soldiers? She asked, her skepticism clear. The officer didn't flinch. We can take them on, yes, but not without help. And that's where you come in. I know what you did on that ship. You've got a unique ability to lead, to fight when everything seems lost. You've already proven that. We need people like you. We need soldiers, leaders, and we need every scrap of knowledge you have about the Drakari. Elena stared at him for a moment, absorbing his words. There was something raw and honest in his plea. She knew that they were all desperate, but she couldn't bring herself to fully trust him. Not yet. Not after everything she had been through. But the reality of the war against the Drakari was harsh. They couldn't afford to waste time. She glanced at her children, both of them watching her carefully. They were no longer the innocent souls who had been caught in the crossfire. They had seen too much, learned too quickly, and now they were her equals in the fight for survival. Elena knew they were ready to face whatever came next, just as she was. We'll think about it, Elena said softly, her voice steady but laced with determination. But we're not sitting around waiting for the Drakari to regroup. You want us to help? Then we'll need more than just safe zones. We need to strike. We need to push them back. The officer nodded. Agreed. That's the plan. But we'll need time to rebuild. We need you to help us recruit. You've seen how the Drakari operate, how they think. Your knowledge is invaluable. Elena's grip tightened on the shuttle's controls as she took a deep breath. She had made a promise to her children. She had promised to keep them safe, to give them a chance at a future. But in the back of her mind, she knew that safety was a fleeting thing in this galaxy. The Drakari wouldn't stop. They never stopped. What's the rendezvous point? She asked, breaking the silence. The officer pulled up a star map on the shuttle's display screen, pointing to a cluster of stars near the outer rim. It's a small colony, but we've established a network there. We've got supplies, medical teams, and a way to communicate with other resistance cells. It's the best shot we have at staying ahead of the Drakari. Elena's eyes lingered on the map for a moment before she turned her attention back to the stars outside. The vastness of space was both beautiful and terrifying. They were so small in this universe, so fragile. But something inside Elena burned with a fierceness she hadn't felt before. The Drakari had taken so much from her, from all of them. And they were still out there, still threatening everything she held dear. We'll help, Elena said at last, her voice low but unwavering. But don't expect us to sit around waiting for orders. I'm not going to hide. We fight. We fight back. And we don't stop until they've learned that humans don't die easily. Sophie and Adam, who had been listening closely, exchanged a look between themselves before turning back to their mother. There was no fear in their eyes anymore. Only resolve. We're with you, Mom, Adam said, his voice full of determination. Sophie nodded, her small hand slipping into her mother's. Elena smiled at them, a small but fierce smile that spoke of all the love, strength, and hope she had left to give. She looked back at the officer, who had been silently watching them. Prepare for departure, Elena said. We'll take this fight to them. Together. As the shuttle drifted through the stars, leaving the wreckage of the Drakari warship behind, Elena felt the weight of the galaxy on her shoulders. The war was far from over, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like they had a chance. Humanity wasn't just a victim in this war. They were survivors, fighters. And no matter how many battles lay ahead, Elena knew that they would face them head-on, together. There was nothing stronger than the will of a mother, and nothing more powerful than a family united by a shared cause. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.